Well, hello everyone. In this lecture, we will be talking about the executive branch. Now, as you know, the function of the executive branch is to enforce the law that is passed by the legislative branch. But that's not the only thing that the executive branch does. Uh, when we think of the executive branch, we tend to think of the office of the presidency. But in fact, the executive branch incorporates not just the office of the presidency, but also the entire presidential cabinet, which is fairly large. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the role of the president. Um, we will talk about the qualifications of the president. We'll talk about presidential succession. Some of the times when the elected president either died or resigned from office. It was replaced by the vice president. So we'll talk about some of those. We'll talk about the office of the vice president. We'll talk about the electoral college, the enumerated powers of the president, and finally we will go through uh, the cabinet itself, talking about um, the various cabinet positions and some of the things that they do. Uh, and kind of, I said finally, but we will also talk about the executive office of the president. Uh, so to start off with, what is it that the president does? Um, well, of course, we the president's role really is as the face of the United States. When a foreign dignitary comes, the president is the person that they really want to see. Uh, so he is the chief of state, but he's also the chief diplomat. He's the commander in chief of the military. In some respects, he's the chief legislator. You could say that if uh, the president has a role in approving legislation. If the president doesn't want a piece of legislation to pass, it's pretty unlikely that that legislation is going to become law because as we've seen earlier, it takes a two-thirds vote by Congress, both chambers, to override a presidential veto. So the president does have, even though he doesn't have the constitutional authority to initiate legislation, occasionally the president will initiate legislation because the president has friends in Congress who can get the process started for the president. But even though the president doesn't generally initiate legislation, the president can terminate legislation if it is not to the president's liking. The president gets paid. He's entitled to compensation under the Constitution. He gets paid $400,000 a year. It's been that same salary without increase since 2001, since before 2001, really. In addition, the president gets a travel account, a expense account, entertainment account. He gets the use of Air Force One for travel. He uses the White House, which is a 132-room mansion on an 18-acre estate. There's a fleet of automobiles. He gets Camp David, which was uh, originally a bunker for the president to be whisked away to in times of national emergency. But it was supposed to be a secret bunker until well, word got out. So now it's Camp David, and it's his getaway resort. On retirement, the president receives a pension. The former first lady also receives a small pension. So, what are the qualifications? In order to be president, you must be a natural born citizen. Um, of course, that raises an interesting question because the first few presidents that we had were British. were born prior to what I mean by that, they were born prior to the revolution, and so they were actually British subjects, not natural-born American citizens. But the Constitution gets around that by saying that there's an exception for those who participated in the revolution, that they can become a president. The actual first person to have been born in the United States to serve as president was Martin Van Buren. He was born in 1782. The president needs to be at least 35 years old. John Kennedy is the youngest to be elected into office, but the youngest to actually serve as president was Teddy Roosevelt, who was 42. He ascended to the presidency when William McKinley was assassinated. The oldest is the one we have right now, Mr. Biden, who was 77 years old when he was elected. Most presidents are in their 50s. Barack Obama was 47 years old when he took office. The next qualification is that you must have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. All of these are in Article 2 of the Constitution. The president serves 2 terms of 4 years each. The 22nd Amendment made this official, but prior to that, there wasn't any constitutional requirement that you not serve more than 2 terms. It was just the standard. George Washington served only 2 terms, and after he set that standard, all presidents who were elected to a second term, of course not all of them were, but any president elected to a second term understood that that was their last term in office. But when Roosevelt became president, Franklin Roosevelt, I mean, there were some problems going on. We had the Great Depression was going on, and then suddenly we have World War II, and Franklin Roosevelt felt that he needed to stay in office, and in fact, he served a total of 4. He was elected 4 times to the presidency. But we'll come back to him later in a minute. Presidential succession. If the president dies in office or resigns from office, the vice president takes over, and that's actually happened 9 times in the history of the United States. And here are the 9. First, William Henry Harrison, pardon me, died in 1841. He was he was an older man, and his health was at issue during the election. People thought that maybe he was not healthy enough to serve as president. And the story is that, of course, there's historians that debate this, but the story is that when he was elected, he gave an hour-long inauguration address in wintertime, late winter, without wearing sufficient warm clothing. And he subsequently caught pneumonia and died. So I suppose maybe the issue of his health should have been addressed more seriously. But when he died, John Tyler became president, and there was some debate, and there continued to be some debate about the Constitution as it was drafted doesn't make it entirely clear that if the president dies in office, that the vice president becomes the president, or merely acts as the president until the next election. But with John Tyler, they called him His Excellency, which I'm sure he I'm sure he loved being called that. Next, we have Zachary Taylor, who died in 1850. He was a war hero in the Mexican War, which most people don't even aren't even aware that we had a war with Mexico, but we did. Just prior to the Civil War, we had a war with Mexico where we got possession of Texas and the areas that became New Mexico, Nevada, and California. And then, just a few years after that, we discovered all this gold and silver in California and Nevada. So I'm sure they were sad that they lost the rights to those territories. But Zachary Taylor became president, and then he died from eating unwashed fruit. Died from gastroenteritis. So the moral of that story is always wash your fruit before you eat it. Millard Fillmore was his vice president, and he became president upon Zachary Taylor's death. Millard Fillmore did not otherwise distinguish himself. Andrew Johnson became president when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Just a matter of weeks after the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by a John Wilkes Booth, who was from Virginia. And as you probably know, when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln, he assassinated him in a booth in one of the boxes at Ford's Theater, and then he leaped to the stage after having shot Lincoln, and he said "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants," and it's sounds like fancy words until you realize that that's actually the motto of the state of Virginia. Next, James Garfield was assassinated in 1881, and Chester Arthur became president. William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, and Teddy Roosevelt moved up to become president. Teddy Roosevelt was previously in politics in New York State, and they decided to put him in the position of the vice presidency because they thought that they could get rid of him by putting him in a relatively insignificant office like the vice president's position. And imagine their dismay when unexpectedly William McKinley was assassinated. And now Teddy Roosevelt, the guy that they put in the vice presidency to get rid of, now he is the president. One of his opponents was heard to state, "Now that damned cowboy is president," and yeah, he was. Next, Warren Harding died of. We don't really know what he died of because Warren G. Harding was sort of a ladies' man, and one of the jobs that the Secret Service was given was to prevent Mrs. Harding from entering the Oval Office. No, Mrs. Harding, you can't go in. He's busy right now. Well, he was known to have had multiple affairs, and he was on a speaking tour of California with his wife in 1923 when he rather suddenly died. And Mrs. Harding refused to allow an autopsy. So the reason for his death, maybe Mrs. Harding poisoned him, who knows. Calvin Coolidge became president when Warren Harding died. Warren Harding was the unfortunate recipient of, there was a number of scandals not directly tied to Harding. Harding actually said that my problem is not with my enemies, but with my damned friends. The people that he had appointed to office turned out to be unscrupulous, many of them. And the Teapot Dome scandal, where government land was rented out to oil speculators, blew up after Harding's death. Nothing was ever attributed to actually Harding. It was just the fact that he was maybe not paying close enough attention to what his friends were doing. Anyway, next we have Franklin Roosevelt, who died in 1945. Franklin Roosevelt was, as you probably know, stricken with polio in his early years, in his 30s. He actually went. He was he was in politics at the time, in New York State politics, and the story is that he went to visit a Boy Scout troop in an area in New York State, and he went swimming with them. And one of the ways, apparently, that you would it was known that you could catch the polio virus was through transmission by water. And Franklin Roosevelt came down with an illness, and when he recovered from the illness, he had lost the use of his legs. So he thought he was done with politics, but he managed to recover. I mean, he never recovered the use of his legs, but he recovered politically. And strangely enough, the press cooperated with this ruse. He never. There were almost no photographs taken of him by the press while he was in his wheelchair. You can see images of him, video in fact, of him apparently walking. He had a set of steel braces made for his legs that he wore under his clothing. And by having two strong men at each side of him, he was able to swing his legs around so that it appeared that he could stand and walk. Whenever he had to go to a speaking engagement, he always arranged it so that he could approach the lectern without a lot of people observing him without anybody actually seeing him getting out of his car, which he always did with the assistance of assistants. So Franklin Roosevelt, of course, had this disability, and he frequently went to an area of Georgia called Warm Springs, which he felt that swimming or bathing in the warm springs of that area benefited him. And he, in fact, set up a polio hospital there for other people who had suffered from polio. And that is still there. When Roosevelt attended, it was called the Little White House. And it was, in fact, there that Franklin Roosevelt died. The oddity, the scandal associated with his death, though, is that he had, he married Eleanor Roosevelt. Her name was Eleanor Roosevelt before Franklin Roosevelt married her. She was a distant cousin, and in fact was related to Teddy Roosevelt from that side of the family. When and Eleanor did many things in her role as First Lady that Franklin Roosevelt could not do. She became his eyes and ears. She would go to during the depths of the Depression, she would go to the places where, say, the coal miners were working to report on conditions there. But Franklin Roosevelt had an affair early on in their marriage, and when Eleanor Roosevelt discovered it, she was obviously quite distraught, and he promised that he would never see this woman again. But the woman was at Warm Springs when Franklin Roosevelt died, and Mrs. Roosevelt was not present, but she learned about it. And perhaps the most tragic thing about it is that she learned that it was her own daughter who had facilitated the meeting between Franklin Roosevelt and his mistress. The last words that Roosevelt said, he was actually sitting while someone was painting his portrait, and he said that I have a terrific headache. He died of brain aneurysm. And Harry Truman took office when Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. And as I said, he was elected and to 4 terms, and he died early in his 4th term. Following his death, Republicans passed an amendment to the Constitution, the 22nd Amendment, so that no Democrat would serve in the office of the presidency for that long ever again. Next, we have John Kennedy, who was assassinated in November of 1963, and Lyndon Johnson became president following his death. And finally, Richard Nixon, who resigned from office in the midst of the Watergate scandal in 1974. Gerald Ford became president. It's kind of an oddity there because Richard Nixon's when he ran for office, his vice president was a fellow named Spiro Agnew from New Jersey. And Spiro Agnew had to resign because of corruption on many levels. He didn't pay his income tax the way he should have, and apparently he had been receiving bribes uh, from the time when he was in politics in New Jersey. So he had to resign, and Richard Nixon appointed Gerald Ford to be his new vice president. So when Nixon resigned, here we have Gerald Ford, who had never been elected to any kind of office except he was a member of Congress. So he was vice president, unelected, and now he's president, unelected. One of the first things that Gerald Ford did was to pardon Richard Nixon because he felt that it was best for the country to move on rather than to focus on some of the dumb things that Richard Nixon did while he was in office. The record that we have of Richard Nixon is that we call it the Watergate affair because what happened was while Nixon was he was elected in 1968 to his first term, and then in 1972 he ran for a second term, and it was apparent that during the election somebody broke into the Democratic National Headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they were caught in the midst of this burglary. The burglary occurred in the Watergate Center, which is not far from the White House. And after these burglars were caught, it was pretty quickly recognized that they were on the payroll of the White House. They were a member of this committee called the Committee to Re-elect the President, called CREEP. There isn't any evidence that Nixon knew that the burglary was going to take place that I'm aware of. But when it became known that Richard Nixon had recorded everything that happened in the Oval Office, those recordings were subpoenaed by Congress over Nixon's objection. And the recordings indicate that Nixon knew about the burglary after the fact and attempted to cover it up. And that was his undoing. And that's why Richard Nixon resigned. All right, so the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 gives us a long, long list of who would become president if the president dies in office and some other individuals also die in office. By 1947, we were well aware of the damage that could be caused by an atomic bomb, for example. So Congress began thinking, well, what happens if an atomic bomb lands, lands in Washington? So they created this list. The president, of course, if the president dies, the vice president becomes president. And if the vice president and president die, it goes next to Speaker of the House. From there, it goes to the President pro tem in the Senate. Then it goes to the Secretary of State, then to the Secretary of the Treasury, then to the Secretary of Defense, and to the Attorney General, and so on down the list of all cabinet positions, essentially in the order of when they were created. I'm not going to go over all of that now because I'm going to go over, the cabinet positions in a minute. Let's talk about the vice president next. What does the vice president do? Well, not much. John Adams, who was the first vice president, he said, I am vice president. In this, I am nothing, but I may be everything. Because the real function of the vice president is to be there if something should happen to the president, you then move up into the office. The only official role of the vice president is to serve as the president of the Senate. But even in that position, it's pretty boring because you can't participate in the debate. And John Adams certainly was a vigorous debater, and he really would have enjoyed being able to participate, but he was unable, prohibited by Constitution. the only real thing that the vice president does, sitting as president of the Senate, is you can cast a vote if needed to break a tie in the Senate. Other than that, you don't participate. John Garner, who was the vice president for 2 terms under Franklin Roosevelt, said that the office of the vice president isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit. And there's some indication that he may have said something stronger than that. If only he had stuck around, though, he could have been 2 more terms. He could have been president because Franklin Roosevelt, as we know, died in office. But John Garner didn't like the office at all. Now let's talk about the Electoral College. Everybody is confused about the Electoral College. Many people hate the Electoral College, but let's talk about this. The original thought of the founders when they created the Electoral College was that the majority of people, I mean, the people that live in the United States, certainly at the time, had no great knowledge of politics. It was a nation of farmers, and the information that they got was not current. It was either secondhand or was carried in the newspaper, which, newspapers have always been biased one way or the other. So rather than allow the people direct hand at selecting the president, what the founders instead decided to do was to what the Constitution says about the electors is it states that the individual states should select a number of electors who will be equal to the number of representatives plus the number of senators that state possesses. And so the Congress really just so the number of electors that we get really is tied directly to the population of each state. And the thinking was that, okay, each state will pick the electors who are savvy enough to know who would be a good president. The founders had not anticipated the development of political parties at the time that they were drafting the Constitution. There were no political parties at the time because there was no country at the time. We were still operating under the Articles of Confederation when this particular clause was drafted. So the thinking was that we'll get a group of people together, and each group will vote on the best person that they think would be fit for the job of the presidency. Well, unfortunately, political parties rapidly developed, and so by the time of Thomas Jefferson's election, it was a terrible embarrassment there because the Electoral College, there was a tie in the Electoral College, and we've talked about this before, I'm sure, but there was a tie in the Electoral College between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Now, what the Constitution says is that the person who has the most votes in the Electoral College will be president, and the person who has the runner-up, the next most votes, will be vice president. That's what the original Constitution set forth. That's not the way we do things now, but that's because of the election in Thomas Jefferson's case. After the embarrassment of that, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution changed the way that we pick president and vice president. The Electoral College, there was a tie, and then it went, of course, as the Constitution says, it goes to the House of Representatives for them to try to break the tie. They voted in the Electoral College, and it was a tie again. And they debated and debated and debated, and it was many, many votes that they went through, unable to agree on who should be president or who should be vice president. And the odd thing is that it was Alexander Hamilton who stepped up in favor of Thomas Jefferson. Now, Hamilton was not the same political party as Jefferson, but he felt that Aaron Burr would not be a good choice for president. With Alexander Hamilton's support, Thomas Jefferson became president and Aaron Burr became vice president. And then as some of you know, 2 years later, he shot and killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. So how does the Electoral College work? Well, in modern terms, when we go to cast our vote for the president, we're actually voting for the slate of electors that has been chosen for our state. And how are they chosen? Well, the electors are picked by every, well, let's do it this way. If there are candidates, if there's the Democratic Party has a candidate for president, the Republican Party has a candidate for president, the Green Party has a candidate for president, the Red Party has a candidate for president, and they're all on the ballot in the state of Florida. Well, every single party, this is how the state of Florida does it, and most other states, every single party will present a list of their proposed electors in advance of the election, and they will send that to the Secretary of State, who then locks it up in a vault somewhere. And then when after the popular vote is counted, whoever has the most votes will get all of Florida's electors. Florida, like most states, uses winner-take-all method. And here is the oddity. And this is, I think, what bothers people about the Electoral College. Aside from the fact that we're not really directly voting for the president, we're voting for a group of people who are going to pick for us. It's kind of makes us feel like we're being babysitted or something, babysat. But let me pull up something here, which is the Electoral College map, so that we can look at it. This is the map of the current assignment of electors to each state. You see that Florida has 30, Texas has 40, California has 54. We are the biggest in the nation. But some of these states in the Midwest, the minimum number of electors you can get is 3. And those states that have 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, there's a few of those, but the amount of population compared to the number of electors that they get in a lot of those states is really unbalanced. Some of the states that only have 3 have population that, well, the city of Tampa has more population than some of those entire states. So it really is unbalanced. They get more power in terms of the number of electors than they're entitled to. It's not a fair. It's not equal in terms of power, is what I'm saying. So it is possible, and it has happened a few times, for a president to be elected. Well, let me explain one other thing. We use a plurality vote rather than a majority vote to determine who gets the electors. What a plurality means is the most votes. So what that comes down to is this: if there are 3 candidates running for president in our state, and the Republican candidate gets 45%, the Democrat candidate gets 43%, and the remaining candidate gets all the other votes. Well, who gets all of Florida's electors? The person who got the most votes. And even though that person is not the one who got a majority of votes in the state of Florida, just the one who got the most votes. We get under the winner take all. They get all of our electoral votes, and because of that, the states that have smaller numbers, like these out in the West, they become important. And there have been a few times where a candidate has only gotten, say, 49% of the vote, not a majority, but they nevertheless got they won a sufficient number of electors in the Electoral College to become the president. And it's that kind of thing that I think troubles most people about the Electoral College, that it is possible for somebody to be the president that the most of us did not vote for. Could we get rid of the Electoral College? Yeah, we probably could. But one advantage of the Electoral College is this. If we go back and look at some of the disputed elections, like, for example, the Bush-Gore election that happened many years ago, the difference between George Bush's win and Albert Gore's win was about 500 votes, seriously. And Florida was the state that determined which of those two would get it. The problem was that there were difficulties. There was trouble with Florida's, the way that Florida handled the ballot. We had um, in some counties there was every county was allowed to design their own ballot, which was one trouble. In Palm Beach County, they had something called a butterfly ballot, where the names were printed on opposite sides of the ballot, but you would punch a hole down the center by the name of the person you were voting for. And it was possible for you to punch a hole thinking you were voting for this person, when in fact you were voting for this person. The majority of people that live in Palm Beach County, if a majority of them are Jewish, a significant number of them are Jewish, if not a majority. And yet there was an outsized number of people in that area who voted for Pat Buchanan, who is not the kind of individual that you would think would be somebody that most Jewish people would vote for. So there was that kind of trouble. And there was a challenge to it, and ultimately we know that George Bush won the election. But here's the other one. I can't say for sure that there was clear evidence of electoral vote fraud in that election. Just there was difficulties with it. But there has been one example of electoral college voting fraud, and that was shortly after, sometime after the Civil War, when Rutherford B. Hayes was running against Samuel Tilden. And that involved 3 states. And what happened there is Tilden was expected to be the winner. But Rutherford Hayes was showing an unexpectedly strong showing. And somebody, it was never determined exactly who, but somebody up in New York State wired the 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, and simply asking, Hayes is showing strong in the election. Can you hold your state? And the response from somebody in each of those 3 states was yes. Now, when the time came to count the Electoral College ballots on January 6th, when Congress met in Washington, D.C., they opened up all the ballots. And the ballots from Louisiana and Florida and South Carolina, they got 2 sets of ballots from each state. And they could not determine which was the true ballot and which was the fake. One set of ballots said if they added those to the total number would mean that Tilden had won. The other set of ballots, if they added it to the total number, would mean that Harrison had won. I'm sorry, not Harrison, Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes. So it went to a committee, and ultimately they just reached a compromise that the South would agree with Rutherford B. Hayes being president if they would remove federal troops from the South. And that's really how, this was 1876, and that's how Reconstruction ended. But that was a clear example of electoral vote fraud. And here's the one advantage that I have to the Electoral College that I would suggest. If there is a claim of Electoral College vote fraud, at least we can most likely limit it to just a few states, one state or just a few states. if we had a claim of voting fraud without the Electoral College, it could go on for years because just having the popular vote without limiting it from state to state as we do with the Electoral College could conceivably extend out to electoral fraud in all states, which would mean that it would be a matter of looking to every single district to see how every single county perhaps to see what was the process for counting votes in that county. That kind of granular analysis could really wreak havoc with trying to figure out who is the winner of the election. So, should we get rid of the Electoral College? I don't know. Well, it would require a constitutional amendment to do so, and we'll see. That's up to you to decide, I suppose. Next, let's look at the enumerated powers of the president. The Constitution says that the president has authority in the following areas. First, the president has power of the national security because he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, including the National Guard. He has legislative power to the extent that he does have the authority to appoint all vacancies when the Senate is in recess. Now, the fact that he has that power as a practical matter doesn't mean that he should exercise that power. President Obama, for example, attempted to fill a number of positions while the Senate was in recess, and it actually went up to the Supreme Court and they struck some of those appointments. If the president does appoint during the Senate's recess, it generally means that that president is not getting along well with the Senate, and so the president has to wait until the Senate is in recess to make his appointments. So it's not a good idea to do. The president has the power, but as a practical matter, probably should not exercise it. The president has the administrative authority to appoint a number of the leaders of various offices. There's approximately 3,000 positions where the president has that power. Most of these remain unchanged from term to term. The president has the power, and his office has the power to prepare a budget which is submitted to Congress for approval. This is all part of his administrative authority as president. And that's a good thing because it allows him to announce what his idea is for improving the United States, and to put actual physical numbers to the things that he thinks where the money should be spent. Congress still has to authorize it and approve it, and they generally don't. But still, it's one thing to be able to say, I was first, this is what I wanted done, and then let Congress respond to it. Next, the president has pardon power. This only extends to federal offenses. The president doesn't have the power to pardon a person who has violated the laws of a state only. An example of this is Andrew Johnson issued amnesty in 1868 to all the soldiers who fought for the South, not the officers, but the soldiers. And in 1977, Jimmy Carter gave amnesty to all those who dodged the draft during the Vietnam War. So those are some examples of pardon power. Next, the president has the executive authority, and the president issues what is referred to as an executive order. George Washington was the first, of course, to use executive orders. The best example that I can think of an executive order that you would be familiar with would be the Emancipation Proclamation, where during the midst of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln announced that all slaves who are in those states currently in rebellion are free. And that's the basis for the holiday, currently federal holiday of Juneteenth, which commemorates the receipt of certain people in Texas, I think, of the knowledge that the president had announced that they were no longer slaves. So, all right, those are the enumerated powers of the president. Next, I want to talk about the War Powers Resolution. And this is important because it's an attempt to rein in some of the executive authority of the president under circumstances where perhaps a president might be inclined to overuse or abuse constitutional power given to him. The War Powers Resolution was enacted in response to Richard Nixon's unpopular pursuit of the Vietnam War, and it was passed in 1973. Nixon vetoed it, but Congress overrode his veto, as one of the few times they've been able to do that. What the War Powers Resolution says is, the president is the commander in chief of the military, and so if the president says, "Go invade Vietnam," well, but the military is not going to stop and ask him why. They're just going to obey the orders of the commander in chief. What the War Powers Resolution says is that when the president does something like that, and think the last time that Congress has declared war on anybody was World War II. How many military incursions have we engaged in since World War II? Well, let's see. There's the Vietnam War. Before that, there was Korea, Grenada. There's just a long list. None of those, including our invasion of Iraq, none of those, or Afghanistan, none of those was an actual declaration of war by Congress, but was simply the commander-in-chief directing the military to do something. The War Powers Resolution states that within 48 hours after committing U.S. forces to combat abroad, the president must report to Congress explaining what has been done and why. And combat commitment must end within 60 days unless Congress agrees to an extension or unless they agree that the actions of the president in using U.S. forces was appropriate. And that is, in fact, what has happened ever since the War Powers Resolution was approved and well, ever since they overrode Nixon's veto in 1973 to make this a law. Every president since then has complied with the War Powers Resolution. Although I suspect that if it was challenged, I think the U.S. Supreme Court would find it unconstitutional. But so far, no president has challenged it. I mean, in practice, if Congress did decide to disapprove of a president's actions in taking our military into action in some foreign country, how would that work out? How would Congress actually do that? Would they decide to stop funding that action? We've got our people in harm's way in another country, and we're actually engaging in some kind of combat with them. And now suddenly Congress is going to stop sending money to buy supplies. That's just not practically. It's just not well thought out. But as I said, so far every president has complied with the War Powers Resolution, so it's better to make a deal, I suppose, than to fight about everything. Next, we're going to talk about the presidential cabinet. Let me see if I can pull up a list of who the cabinet is. I have cabinet. Let's bring this up so we can share. This is the current cabinet under Mr. Biden. It's clear that with the next president, we're going to have different. The cabinet will be different, but this is who we have presently. And each of these positions, I'm going to go through them in the order in which they were created. All right, we're going to talk briefly about what it is that they do. I've already talked about the vice president, so we'll talk about the Secretary of State. This position was created in 1789. And the purpose of the Secretary of State currently is to deal with foreign affairs exclusively. We have their duty is to negotiate agreements with foreign countries, advise the president on foreign policy, and they represent the U.S. abroad and in international organizations. So if you are an ambassador to a particular country, you're working for the Secretary of State. That's the office that you're in. Next, we have the Secretary of Defense. Treasury. And they do exactly what you think they do. They produce coins and bills. They collect taxes. They borrow money. They manage the public debt. All of that is under the Secretary of Treasury. The Secretary of Defense does what you think they do also. All of these positions, and including the next one, the Attorney General, were created in 1789. These were the original 4 members of the cabinet that advised the president from the very beginning. The Secretary of Defense provides military forces and protects the nation's security. The Attorney General is responsible for prosecuting and enforcing federal law. They also operate federal prisons and occasionally provides legal advice to the president and generally represents the United States in federal courts. Next, we have the Interior. This position was created in 1849, and the Secretary of the Interior manages public lands. They operate the federally managed hydroelectric plants like Hoover Dam and some of those very large dams that are created to not only to manage the water supply, but also to create electricity. And the Interior is responsible for assisting Native Americans. Next, we have Agriculture. This office was created in 1889. The Agriculture Department manages national forests. They also inspect food and assist farmers and ranchers. They are responsible for helping farmers to determine what to grow and what not to grow. As we've talked about earlier in the federalism lecture, one of the things that the Secretary of Agriculture does is to pay farmers a subsidy to let maybe their fields to sit fallow for a season in order to make sure that the prices for the market prices for their produce don't fluctuate too much. Agriculture also administers food stamps and school lunch programs. Next, we have Commerce. The Commerce Department was created in 1903, and some of the things that they do, they're responsible for conducting the decennial census. They are operating the patents, copyrights, and trademarks offices. They also work on technological development and economic growth, as you might expect from somebody in the area of commerce. Next, Secretary of Labor, created in the midst of the Great Depression in 1939. Secretary of Commerce was created in 1903, by the way. Secretary of Labor is responsible for making sure that businesses pay the minimum wage as set by the federal government. They're responsible for enforcing safe working conditions, OSHA, for example, the Occupational Safety and Hazards Act. They also administer workers' compensation and unemployment insurance programs. Next, we have the Health and Human Services. They're primarily responsible for enforcing pure food and drug laws. They also administer Medicare and Medicaid. This was Health and Human Services was created in 1953. Next, Housing and Urban Development was created in 1965. They operate home financing and public housing programs. They also work to enforce fair housing laws. We're almost to the end here. The Secretary of Transportation was created in 1967. and they administer programs to promote and regulate highways, the interstate system, uh, mass transit, railroads, and also, not surprisingly, oil and gas pipelines, because those things are necessary for transportation. Next, the Secretary of Energy was created in 1977, which was primarily in response to during that time period we had an issue with the oil embargo by the Arab oil embargo, long lines at the gas pumps in 1977. The purpose of the Secretary of Energy is to promote the production of renewable energy. We suddenly got the idea that maybe we shouldn't be reliant upon uh, petroleum quite so much. So renewable energy, fossil fuels, nuclear energy, and they transmit and sell hydroelectric power that is created by the hydroelectric dams that are managed by the Secretary of the Interior. Next, we have education. They administer federal aid to school, and they also conduct educational research because we're still not sure how to teach. Next, we have, education was created in 1979. Veterans Affairs, which is next, was created in 1988. And they were responsible for administering benefits, pensions, and medical programs for veterans, and they also oversee military cemeteries. Finally, the Secretary of Homeland Security was created in 2002 in response to the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers. The Secretary of Homeland Security is responsible for, as you might expect, border and transportation security, emergency preparedness and response, and I think also the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is now under the supervision of the Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, all of these are cabinet positions, and if you recall, the original purpose of the cabinet was to advise the president, and a president certainly cannot be an expert in all things. So the president needs to have advisors on things that the president may not be as familiar with as the president needs to be in order to make a decision. The interesting thing is that if we go all the way back to the beginning, George Washington was not well educated. He had a regular education. He was a trained as a surveyor, so he knew a lot about that aspect of. I mean, that certainly helped him when he was a military commander. But when he became president, he sought out the assistance of smart people. So he got John Adams as his vice president, smart lawyer from Boston. He got Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State, smart lawyer from Virginia. He got Alexander Hamilton to serve in the Treasury Department, smart lawyer from New York City. So that's generally what the cabinet originally was for. But since about 1939, the cabinets have become so large, and the executive branch generally has become so large that it became recognized that the cabinet really is no longer in a position to be able to directly advise the president on daily matters. So in 1939, the executive office of the presidency was, the executive office of the president was created to assist President Roosevelt. And this consists of presidential advisors and staff assistants who help the president to do his job. And the different positions that exist in the executive office of the presidency are really up to the president, really, to determine which offices that the president wants to have. There's the chief of staff. There's an office dealing with. Let me share this because this might help. If we look back to this page again, we have. These are the people who are in the current Biden administration's executive office of the presidency. There's the chief of staff. We have somebody advising the president on environmental protections. We have a national intelligence director, U.S. trade representative, ambassador. These are, a lot of them are duplicates of what are the actual cabinet positions, but these are people that are available for, advice to the president, should the president need it. And that's the purpose of the executive office of the presidency. As I said, all of these positions will shift and change according to what president is in office at any given time. All right, that's my discussion of the executive branch. I want to thank you for your time and attention, and we will convene again soon to talk about the judicial branch.